The police burst in to rescue a bear from a giant python, but what the bear did next was shocking. Never before had Senior Lieutenant Viktor Sokolov and his partner, Sergeant Anna Petrova, who patrolled the remote corners of the Siberian taiga, encountered anything like this. The morning call from frightened mushroom foragers sounded so wild that it initially brought only a skeptical smirk. A bear and some enormous snake near Black River, screaming, "Come quickly!" A snake in Siberia. A giant one. Sokolov, with over 10 years in the forest police, had seen it all, from poacher traps to enraged boars, but this defied belief. Still, duty was duty. Their old but reliable UAZ, nicknamed the Sneak for its ability to handle any terrain, growled its way through the muddy forest trail. The air was thick and damp after the night's rain, smelling of rotting leaves, mushrooms, and something else, faint but deeply unsettling, causing Victor's heart to beat faster. He gripped the steering wheel tighter, scanning the passing trunks of pines and firs. Anna sat silently beside him, checking the radio, her face focused. She was younger than Sokolov but had already proven herself brave and capable. "Do you believe this?" she asked quietly, breaking the silence. Sokolov shrugged. "People imagine all sorts of things when they're scared. But there's never smoke without fire. Let's check it out. Maybe two bears fought, and the snake part is just panic." But the closer they got to the location, the clearer became a strange low hum, interspersed with sharp, almost inhuman squeals. It didn't sound like any normal bear fight. The tension grew. Their UAZ pulled into a small clearing, and what they saw froze even the seasoned Sokolov in place. He gripped the radio so tightly his knuckles turned white. On the damp grass, near the edge of the dark river, a massive brown bear lay writhing in her death throes. Her powerful body, normally a symbol of the taiga's indomitable strength, was wrapped in gleaming, muscular coils of a giant python. The monstrous snake, as thick as a telephone pole, was squeezing with lethal force. The bear wheezed, her paws scraping helplessly at the earth, her wide-open eyes filled with terror and despair. It was a scene from a nightmare, utterly unreal for these latitudes. The python seemed like an invader from a hostile, alien world, now mercilessly devouring a piece of their native wilderness. Anna gasped, covering her mouth. Sokolov swore under his breath. The coffee he'd drunk earlier rose like a lump in his throat. He'd never seen anything like it. This wasn't just a predator attack, it was a clash between two incompatible worlds, and one of them was clearly losing. Every second counted. The she-bear was suffocating, her movements were growing weaker. Viktor Sokolov jumped from the car, instinctively checking his holster with a steady hand, though he knew shooting was a last resort. One stray bullet could kill the bear. He glanced at Anna. "Call everyone. Rangers. A vet from the reserve if you can. Tell them it's critical." Anna, snapping out of her initial shock, spoke quickly into the radio. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. Sokolov grabbed a heavy splitting axe from the UAZ bed, something he always carried just in case, and slowly approached. The python paid them no attention, fully focused on its prey. Its slick, patterned skin shimmered in the sun, and its massive triangular head was pressed against the bear's neck. The bear let out another heart-wrenching wheeze. There was no time. Victor knew how dangerous this was. One wrong move and the snake could turn on him, but he couldn't just stand by and watch such a mighty creature die. He raised the axe, gauging where to strike without harming the bear. It seemed almost impossible. Then, just as he lifted the axe, a deafening roar erupted from the dense willows across the riverbank. so powerful it seemed to shake the trees themselves. Crashing through the bushes, breaking branches like twigs, charged a massive grizzly, a male, nearly black and 1.5 times the size of the she-bear. A true titan of the taiga. His eyes burned with red fury, the fur on his neck bristled, steam burst from his mouth. He didn't hesitate for a second. Like a raging tank, he charged straight at the python. Sokolov stood frozen, axe raised, stunned by the bear's ferocity. Anna screamed. It was something they could never have expected. The male bear didn't even glance at the humans just meters away. All his primal rage was focused on the monster that had dared to attack his mate on his territory. Sokolov didn't know what bond united these two beasts, but what he saw transcended mere instinct. It was a furious, selfless desperation. The bear slammed into the snake's writhing body, roaring and biting, delivering terrifying blows with his massive clawed paws. The python hissed, tried to tighten its grip, but now it had to defend itself. The battle was fierce and swift. The male grizzly seemed possessed, ignoring the snake's attempts to bite or wrap around him. He ripped and tore. His fangs sank deep into the python's muscle, his claws left long bleeding gashes. The snake thrashed, trying to strike him with its head, but the bear was too fast, too strong, giving it no chance to recover. Sokolov and Anna stood frozen, witnessing this primal clash. The air filled with the roar of the bear, the hiss of the python, and the stench of blood. Beneath the coils, the she-bear whimpered, the grip weakening slightly. "Vitya, he's beating it," Anna whispered, eyes fixed on the titanic duel. Sokolov nodded, still holding the axe, understanding their interference now could cause more harm or provoke the male. But he also saw the python still hadn't fully released the she-bear. "I need to help him, distract the snake from the female," Sokolov decided. "Anna, cover me. If it turns on us, fire into the air." He moved slowly, careful to stay in the male's line of sight, but not come between him and the snake. The grizzly paid no attention to Sokolov, his fury was locked on the enemy. He grabbed the python mid-body with his jaws and, with incredible strength, yanked it off the ground. The snake arched in the air, tail whipping wildly. Sokolov saw his chance. One of the python's coils around the she-bear's chest briefly sagged. He lunged and smashed the back of the axe against it, trying to knock it loose. The blow hit precisely. The python recoiled in pain and surprise, loosening its grip even more. The she-bear gasped, sucking in air. The male took advantage of the distraction, delivering more crushing bites. The python's blood now streamed freely, turning the grass crimson. The snake was beginning to realize it couldn't win. Its movements slowed, its hissing weakened. She began to retreat, trying to slither toward the river, but the male bear had no intention of letting her go. He pursued her, striking blow after blow until the python's wounded body finally disappeared into the dark waters of the Black River. As the last coils of the enormous python vanished beneath the surface, a tense silence settled over the clearing, broken only by the heavy, labored breathing of the male bear and the soft moans of the injured female. The male stood over her. His fur was ruffled and stained in places, with both his blood and the snake's. He was breathing heavily, clouds of steam rising from his mouth despite the summer morning. His massive body trembled from the tension of what had just happened. He paid no attention to Sokolov and Anna, who were still frozen a few steps away, not daring to move. All his focus was on the she-bear lying on the ground. He lowered his head and sniffed her, emitting low, rumbling sounds filled with worry and something that resembled tenderness. The she-bear stirred weakly and let out a soft moan. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing shallow and rapid. Her brown fur was stained with dark, wet patches where the python's coils had crushed her, and a deep scratch on her side was bleeding, most likely from the male's claws that had accidentally struck her during the frenzy of battle. Sokolov slowly lowered his axe. His heart was still pounding in his throat. He exchanged glances with Anna. In her eyes, he saw the same shock and awe he felt himself. What they had just witnessed was something unbelievable. This male hadn't simply defended his territory or a mate, he had fought with a rage and selflessness rarely seen even in humans. He saved her, Anna whispered barely audibly. Sokolov nodded. Yes, looks like it. But she needs help, urgently. He looked back at the she-bear. It was obvious she was seriously injured, possibly with broken ribs, internal trauma. Without veterinary help, she might not survive. But how could they approach her with such a fearsome guardian nearby? The male bear lifted his head and looked directly at them. There was no longer the fury in his small, deep-set eyes, but rather wariness, and an unshakable resolve to protect his mate. He took a few steps forward, positioning himself between her and the humans like a living shield. A quiet, warning growl escaped his lips. Sokolov understood the signal. Easy, easy, boy, he said in a calm, soothing voice, slowly raising his hands, palms forward. We're not going to hurt her, we want to help. He had no idea if the bear understood the words, but maybe the tone could convey his intent. The male continued to stand still, closely watching their every move. At that moment, a voice came through the radio, the dispatcher, then Ranger Semyonik, who reported they were already on their way with Dr. Irina Volskaya, a veterinarian from the reserve. That was good news, but they'd need at least 40 minutes to arrive, maybe more. And the she-bear needed help now. A decision had to be made immediately. Sokolov knew that with every passing minute, her chances of survival were slipping away. But risking his people's lives by trying to drive off an enraged bear by force, that would be madness. He looked again at the bear. He still stood over the female, occasionally bending down and nudging her with his snout, making low, guttural sounds. There was so much genuine concern and devotion in those sounds that something stirred inside Sokolov. He thought of his old shepherd dog, Rex, who waited faithfully at the door when he came home late. Of course, comparing a house dog to a wild bear was absurd, but looking at this mighty creature now, Sokolov didn't see just instinct. He saw something more. Anna, let's try to slowly approach, he said softly. No sudden moves. If he shows any aggression, we back off immediately. The main thing is not to provoke him. Anna nodded. Her face was pale but resolute. They took a few slow, careful steps forward. The male bear immediately tensed. His ears pinned back, and the quiet growl grew louder, more threatening. He stepped toward them, blocking their path. Stop, Sokolov whispered. They froze. For a few seconds, they stood like that, two humans and a massive wild beast, separated by an invisible line. Crossing it could be fatal. Then something astonishing happened. The she-bear moaned softly again, and the male, as if in response to her pain, stepped half a pace back. Just half a step, but it was a sign. A sign Sokolov couldn't ignore. It's like he's letting us, Anna whispered in disbelief. I don't know, Sokolov answered just as quietly. But I think he knows she's in bad shape. Let's try again. They took a few more cautious steps. This time, the bear didn't move, just watched them intently. His massive body was tense like a drawn bowstring. Sokolov stopped a couple meters from the she-bear. He saw how her sides trembled with each breath. He knelt down to appear smaller and less threatening. "Sweetheart, we're going to help you," he said softly, as he would to a wounded child. "Just hang in there a little longer." The male bear made a low guttural sound, but didn't move. It seemed he was weighing every action, every word. At that moment, Sokolov realized this bear wasn't just a wild creature driven by instinct. There was something almost human about him, some deep wisdom and understanding of the situation. He had let them approach because he knew his mate needed help, and he couldn't give it himself. Carefully, avoiding sudden movements, Sokolov moved closer to the injured she-bear. Anna remained slightly behind, ready to help or distract the male if he suddenly changed his mind. The male bear stood a few paces away, like a formidable guardian. His eyes followed Victor's every move. The air was so tense it seemed to hum. Sokolov knelt beside the she-bear. Her fur was damp with sweat and blood. Her body quivered. He gently touched her side with his fingertips, trying to feel a pulse and assess her breathing. She flinched slightly but didn't show aggression. Her pain-filled eyes stared off into the distance. The male bear let out a soft warning growl but didn't move. Sokolov knew he had little time. He quickly examined the visible injuries. There were large bruises on her sides where the python had crushed her. Her fur was matted, skin bluish. Her ribs were likely damaged, possibly even broken. The deep scratch on her side continued to bleed. "I need to stop the bleeding and help her breathe," Sokolov thought. He took out a sterile bandage and antiseptic from the field first aid kit he always wore on his belt. "Anna, hand me the water flask," he asked without looking back. Anna quickly passed it to him. Sokolov dampened a piece of bandage and gently wiped the edges of the wound, then treated it with antiseptic. The she-bear groaned again, but more quietly this time. The male bear stepped forward, nostrils flaring as he sniffed the scent of blood and medicine. Sokolov froze, keeping his eyes on the bear. "It's okay, buddy. I'm helping her," he said again in a calm, reassuring tone. The bear stood still for a few seconds, and then, to Sokolov's immense relief, stepped back again. Victor applied a tight bandage, trying not to cause the she-bear more pain. He understood this was only a temporary measure, she needed professional veterinary care. But he had to do something. Then he began thinking about how they could transport her. She was enormous, weighing no less than 200 kilograms. He and Anna couldn't lift her alone. And if the male wouldn't allow it? The thought made him glance back at the massive creature, still standing motionless like a statue. But in his posture, there was hidden power and readiness to act at any moment. Just as they were about to act in defense, the sound of an approaching vehicle was heard. It was Ranger Semyonik and Dr. Volskaya. Their UAZ stopped at the edge of the clearing. Semyonik, an older, broad-shouldered man with a weathered face, and Irina Volskaya, a young but already experienced veterinarian, quickly exited the vehicle. Upon seeing the scene in the clearing, they froze for a moment. "Good grief," was all Semyonik could say, staring at the two bears and the traces of the recent battle. Irina Volskaya, wasting no time, pulled a syringe and a vial of medicine from her bag. "We need to sedate her, at least partially," she said as she approached Sokolov. "Otherwise, we won't be able to examine or transport her. Keep him at a distance." At the sight of the newcomers, the male bear tensed again and growled, but this time, not aggressively, more as a warning. Despite the intimidating presence of the male, Irina moved quickly and professionally. She filled the syringe with a tranquilizer and painkiller, calculating the dosage based on the female bear's weight. Viktor Andreevich, Semyonik, distract him if needed, she said as she slowly approached the wounded female. Sokolov and Semyonik positioned themselves between the vet and the male, ready to intervene at any moment. Anna stayed by the vehicle, holding a flare gun loaded with signal cartridges, just in case, to scare the animal off if he decided to attack. The male bear closely watched Irina's every movement. He growled, but didn't charge. When Irina injected the massive shoulder of the bear, Tailish flinched weakly. The male let out a loud, anxious roar and took a few steps forward, but Sokolov stepped in his way, raising his hands. "Easy, easy. It will help her," he said firmly, looking directly into the bear's eyes. To everyone's surprise, the bear stopped. He gave a few more disgruntled growls but didn't move, though his gaze became even more intense. A few minutes later, the medication began to take effect. The female's breathing grew steadier, she stopped moaning, and seemed to drift into a light sleep. Irina quickly examined her. "The situation is serious, but not hopeless," she said. "Multiple contusions, possibly fractured ribs. We need to get her to the reserves clinic immediately, take X-rays, and provide full treatment. She definitely won't survive here on her own." Now the main question arose: how to transport such a large and heavy bear, especially under the watchful eye of her fiercely protective companion? In Semyonika's UAZ, there were special canvas stretchers designed for transporting large animals. But loading her onto them would require several people, and no one knew how the male would react to that. "Let's try to move her onto the canvas," suggested Semyonik. "Then we'll see. Maybe he'll calm down once he sees we're taking her away." The four of them, Sokolov, Anna, Semyonik, and Irina, carefully slid the canvas under the bear and, trying not to cause her unnecessary pain, began slowly rolling her onto the stretcher. The male bear remained close, just 2 or 3 meters away, pacing back and forth, making low, anxious sounds. His muscles were taut, but he didn't attack. It seemed he understood that the humans were trying to help his mate. Once the female was finally laid out on the stretcher, Semyonik and Sokolov took the front straps, while Anna and Irina took the rear. They slowly dragged her toward the UAZ. And then something no one expected happened. The male bear followed them, step for step. He didn't lag behind even by a meter. His massive head was lowered, sniffing the trail his mate had left in the grass. When they brought the stretcher to the back of the UAZ, the bear stopped next to them, looking alternately at her and the people. "What now?" Semyonik asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "He's not going to let us take her without him." Sokolov looked at the bear. In his eyes, he saw unwavering determination and devotion, so much so that Viktor no longer had any doubt. This bear wouldn't leave. "Looks like we've got an unusual passenger," he said. "Or at the very least, a very persistent escort." The decision was risky, but seemed like the only option. Trying to drive the bear away by force could end in tragedy. But leaving him behind while they took the injured female meant condemning him to agonizing waiting, and potentially provoking unpredictable behavior in the future. Irina Volskaya suggested a compromise: there's enough room in the back of the UAZ. If we carefully place her on the floor, maybe he'll lie next to her. But it's extremely dangerous. Semyonik scratched his head. "Well, we've transported moose and wild boars before, but a bear voluntarily climbing into the vehicle? Never seen that. But we've got no choice, we've got to try." They carefully began loading the stretcher with the bear into the spacious cargo bed of the UAZ van, making sure not to make any sudden movements. The male bear stood nearby, closely watching their every action. His breathing was heavy, but he didn't growl. Once the she-bear was settled on the floor, which had been covered with old blankets, the male walked up to the open rear doors and peeked inside. He sniffed his mate, gave a quiet growl, and then took a step into the van. Everyone froze, afraid to move. The bear paced a little, then gently lay down beside the wounded female, placing his enormous head on her side. He took up nearly all the remaining space, but lay there calmly, only occasionally licking the she-bear's muzzle. "Incredible," Anna whispered, staring at the scene. Sokolov nodded silently. He had truly never seen anything like it. A wild, powerful animal had voluntarily entered the closed space of a vehicle just to be near his injured mate. It was a display of trust and devotion that was hard to comprehend. "Close the doors before he changes his mind," commanded Semyonik, and they carefully shut the rear doors of the UAZ, leaving a small gap for ventilation. The drive to the reserve's clinic, located several dozen kilometers away, promised to be a tense one. Semyonik drove very carefully, avoiding bumps and sharp turns. Sokolov sat beside him. Anna and Irina were in the back seat, listening intently to every sound coming from the cargo area. From there came only soft snuffling and low growls from the male, no signs of aggression or panic. He was simply there, beside her. The road wound through the forest. The UAZ crawled along the ruts. The sun climbed higher, lighting up the treetops. The cabin was silent. Everyone was lost in thought, but all thoughts centered around the two unusual passengers in the back. Sokolov reflected on how this day had overturned everything he believed about wild animals. He had always respected their strength and beauty, but now he had seen something more, the capacity for deep attachment, self-sacrifice, what humans call love and loyalty. He understood the story wasn't over yet. Ahead lay the female's treatment, and who knows how the male would behave in captivity, even if temporary. But one thing he knew for sure, he would do everything possible to help these two extraordinary creatures. The road to the veterinary clinic of the reserve felt like an eternity. Every kilometer of forest trail echoed with worry in the hearts of those escorting the unusual cargo. When Semyonika's UAZ finally drove through the gate of the clinic, a small complex of wooden buildings surrounded by a tall fence, they were already expected. The director of the reserve, an elderly and respected biology professor named Andrei Nikolaevich, had been notified via radio and came out to meet them along with several staff members. Seeing who was in the back of the vehicle, he gave a low whistle of surprise. "Well, Viktor Andreevich, Semyonik, you've outdone yourselves today," he said, shaking his head. "A python in our taiga is already a sensation, but a bear willingly getting into a car? Tell me everything." While Sokolov and Semyonik briefly recounted what had happened, Irina Volskaya was already directing preparations for the operating room and a spacious holding enclosure. The task ahead was not going to be easy. It was necessary not only to help the injured she-bear but also to ensure the safety of the staff, given the presence of her formidable protector. When the back doors of the UAZ were opened, the male bear looked around cautiously at first, but seeing that his mate was still unconscious, he did not show aggression. He only growled quietly when the reserve staff, acting with extreme caution, began unloading the stretcher with the bear. The unloading process required the utmost precision. Any awkward movement could provoke an unpredictable reaction from the male, but to everyone's astonishment, he behaved surprisingly calmly. He stepped out of the vehicle after the stretcher and walked beside it, not falling behind even a step until the she-bear was brought into a specially prepared room, a spacious area with tiled walls and bright lighting adjacent to the operating room. Irina Volskaya and her assistants immediately began working. The bear was connected to a ventilator, and 4 was set up, blood tests were taken, and the X-rays confirmed their concerns. She had fractures in 3 ribs and severe internal bruising. Fortunately, her vital organs were not seriously damaged. There was hope for recovery, but it required long-term treatment and care. Throughout this time, the male bear remained in the same room. The reserve staff tried several times to lure him into a nearby enclosure with fresh meat and water, but he didn't even glance at the bait. He lay down by the wall opposite the table where his mate was lying and never took his eyes off her. His massive body was tense, but he didn't growl or attempt to approach the veterinarians working. He simply waited, watched, guarded. Andrei Nikolaevich, watching the scene through the observation window, shook his head. In 30 years working in the reserve, I've seen a lot, but this is the first time I've seen something like this. This isn't just instinct, it's something extraordinary. Sokolov stood next to him, feeling chills down his spine. He realized he was witnessing something unique, something that defied conventional understanding of wild animal behavior. The first night at the clinic was a real test for everyone. The she-bear, whom the reserve staff had already mentally nicknamed Umka because of her light-colored muzzle, was breathing heavily. Her condition remained critically stable. Irina Volskaya and her team worked in shifts, constantly monitoring her vital signs, changing IVs, and administering medications. And nearby, in the same room, the male remained constantly present. They named him Potap, for his impressive size and calm, steady strength. Potap barely slept. He lay on the floor with his huge head resting on his front paws, his gaze fixed unwaveringly on Umka. Every time she moaned in her sleep or the equipment made a strange noise, he immediately raised his head, his ears twitching alertly. But he didn't get up or approach, as if understanding that his mate was under the protection of the people he had, for some inexplicable reason, chosen to trust. Several times, the reserve staff tried to offer Potap food, fresh fish, berries, even honey, but he refused everything. Only occasionally did he lick water from a large bowl placed in the corner. His devotion and composure amazed everyone. Even the most experienced workers, who had seen many wild animals over the years, admitted they had never encountered such behavior. It was not merely an instinct to protect a mate, it was a deep, almost human, bond. Loyalty that transcended all imaginable boundaries. Viktor Sokolov visited the reserve several times to check on the bear's condition. He felt a personal responsibility for their fate. After all, he had witnessed that incredible encounter and made the decision to help them. Every time he entered the room where the bears were, he saw the same picture: Umka entangled in wires and 4 tubes, and Potap lying nearby like a faithful guardian. In his gaze, turned towards Sokolov, there was no longer the former wariness, rather, a silent acknowledgement and expectation. He was waiting for his mate to recover, and this waiting seemed to give him strength. On the 3rd day, Umka began to improve slightly. Her breathing became steadier, her temperature dropped, and she began reacting to sounds, slightly moving her head. When Irina Volskaya came to examine her again, Umka opened her eyes and looked at her with a conscious gaze. At that moment, Potap rose, slowly approached the table where Umka was lying, and gently, almost weightlessly, nudged her side with his massive muzzle. Umka gave a faint growl in response. It was their silent dialogue, understood only by the two of them. But everyone in the room felt the incredible bond that existed between these two wild creatures. Irina Volskaya smiled through tears. "She's going to live," she said softly. "And I think this loyal knight had no small part in that." Days turned into weeks. Umka slowly but surely began to recover. Her drainage tubes were removed, she was disconnected from the machines, and she began to eat on her own, first liquid porridge, then fish and berries. Her wounds began to heal, her fur grew back smooth and shiny. And all this time, Potap was beside her. He never left the room where Umka was, even though the reserve staff had already prepared a spacious outdoor enclosure for him with a pool and trees. He ate very little, only enough to maintain his strength, and spent most of his time lying at her feet or simply watching her. His devotion became legendary among the reserve staff and residents of nearby villages. The story of the two bears rescued from the giant python and of the male's incredible loyalty spread throughout the region. Local newspapers wrote enthusiastically about the unique case. Journalists tried to interview Sokolov and the reserve staff. At first, Viktor Andreevich was reluctant to speak with the press, but he soon realized that this story could draw attention to the issues of wildlife conservation, and to the remarkable emotional world that exists in animals, often hidden from human eyes. He spoke of how Potap had fearlessly rushed to defend Umka, how he had never left her side, how he had trusted the people who came to help. These stories inspired admiration and compassion. The reserve began receiving letters and packages, gifts for the bears, honey, nuts, dried fruits. People wanted to be part of the fate of these remarkable creatures. However, as Umka recovered, a more complex question loomed for the reserve staff, and especially for Andrei Nikolaevich. What to do next? Keeping two adult wild bears in a clinic was impossible. They had to be returned to the taiga, but how? Release them together or separately? And what would happen if Potap was separated from Umka again, even temporarily? These questions troubled not only the director, but also the veterinarians and Sokolov, who continued visiting his wards. One day, during a routine check, Andrei Nikolaevich saw that Umka, now considerably stronger, was trying to play with Potap, nudging his side with her paw. Potap lay still at first, but then gently, almost tenderly, clasped her paw with his massive jaws, causing her no harm. In his eyes shone such boundless tenderness that Andrei Nikolaevich involuntarily smiled. "You know, Viktor," he said to Sokolov, who was standing beside him, "I'm more and more convinced we're not just dealing with a pair of bears. This is a true family. And separating them would be a crime." The decision about the future of Umka and Potap was long and difficult. Andrei Nikolaevich held several meetings with leading large predator specialists, consulted colleagues from other reserves. Everyone agreed such a unique bond between two adult bears was extremely rare and deserved the utmost care. Simply releasing them into the nearest forest would be too risky. First, Umka had not yet fully recovered from her injuries and needed time to adapt to life in the wild. Second, Potap, having spent so much time in an enclosed space near humans, might have partially lost his natural caution. A special rehabilitation and reintroduction program was necessary for their return to their natural habitat. The ideal option would be to create a large enclosed area of taiga where they could live in conditions as close to the wild as possible, but still under the supervision of specialists. However, this required significant funds, which the reserve did not have. The widely publicized story of Umka and Potap, thanks to the media, unexpectedly played a role. Upon learning about the reserve's difficulties, philanthropists, local entrepreneurs, and simply concerned citizens responded. The necessary funds were collected to build a spacious rehabilitation enclosure covering several hectares, complete with natural landscape, a water body, and dense forest. Construction took several months. During all this time, Umka and Potap continued living in the clinic. Umka fully recovered and turned into a playful and curious bear. Potap remained the same calm and imperturbable guardian, though he sometimes allowed himself to play with his mate in mock scuffles. His appetite never fully returned, he ate just enough to sustain his strength, as if all his thoughts were focused solely on Umka. One day, an emergency occurred in the reserve. Due to a severe thunderstorm, the electricity went out. The backup generator didn't start immediately, and the clinic was plunged into darkness for several minutes. A sudden loud pop from a short circuit somewhere along the line made Umka flinch in fear and retreat into a corner. Potap instantly jumped to his feet. In the darkness, his eyes flared with a fiery glow. He let out such a fearsome roar that the blood froze in the veins of the nearby staff. He charged around the room, clearly alarmed and ready to defend Umka from an unknown threat. When the generator finally kicked in and the lights came back on, everyone saw Potap standing over Umka, shielding her with his body and growling at the door behind which the footsteps of approaching people could be heard. It took great effort from Sokolov and Irina Volskaya to calm him down and convince him that everything was fine and that Umka was not in danger. This incident once again demonstrated the depth of his attachment and his readiness to protect his mate. Finally, the day of the move to the new rehabilitation enclosure arrived. It was a big event for the reserve. They decided to transport Umka and Potap together to avoid unnecessary stress. A special transport container, spacious enough for both bears, was used. The loading process went surprisingly smoothly. Umka, curious by nature, entered the container on her own, intrigued by the treats laid out inside. Potap, hesitating slightly, followed her. He couldn't leave her alone. The enclosure was a huge piece of real taiga, fenced with a high and sturdy mesh. There were old trees, dense undergrowth, and a small stream flowing into a pond. The reserve staff had tried to create the most comfortable and natural conditions possible for the bears. When the container was opened, Umka was the first to leap out and, purring joyfully, began exploring her new territory. She rolled in the grass, rubbed against tree trunks, and tried to catch fish in the stream. Potap followed more cautiously. He carefully inspected the perimeter of the enclosure, sniffing every bush and stone as if checking the safety of the new home. Once convinced that everything was in order, he joined Umka, and together they disappeared into the depths of the forest. The bears were monitored via hidden video cameras and special GPS collars that had been discreetly placed on them during one of the veterinary checkups. For the first few days, Umka and Potap hardly appeared, getting used to their new territory. Then, they began showing up more often in open areas, by the stream or in sunny meadows. It was clear they felt at home. Umka had fully regained her playfulness and cheerfulness, while Potap remained her loyal companion and protector. He was always nearby, watching her, ready to help at any moment. His appetite had significantly improved, he began gaining weight and looked calmer and more content. The reserve specialists noted that their behavior was becoming more and more natural. They hunted together, rested together, and explored their new world together. Their bond seemed to have grown even stronger. Almost a year had passed since the day Sokolov and Anna had discovered Umka in the deadly grip of the python. Summer had turned into autumn, then came snowy winter, and then another spring. Umka and Potap successfully spent the winter in a den they had dug themselves on the slope of a hill within their enclosure. Andrei Nikolaevich and his team came to the conclusion both bears were fully ready to return to the wild. Their rehabilitation had been successful. All that remained was to choose the right place and time for their release. This decision was not easy. On the one hand, everyone understood that wild animals should live freely. On the other hand, during this time, Umka and Potap had become almost like family to everyone, and the thought of parting with them brought sadness. But duty to nature came first. The place for release was chosen carefully. It was a remote, rarely visited section of taiga rich in food and with suitable conditions for bears. It was located several hundred kilometers from where they had originally been found. It was important that they not return to their old territory, where they might face dangers such as poachers or accidental encounters with people. The transport and release operation was prepared in the strictest secrecy to avoid unnecessary attention. On the appointed day, Umka and Potap were once again loaded into the transport container. This time, they behaved completely calmly, as if they sensed that something important and good awaited them. They were accompanied by Andrei Nikolaevich, Irina Volskaya, Semyonik, and of course, Viktor Sokolov. He couldn't miss this moment. The road was long and difficult. They had to stop several times to check on the bears and give them water. Finally, late in the evening, they arrived at the release site, a remote forest glade surrounded by ancient cedars and firs. The air was clean and fresh, smelling of pine and damp earth. The silence was broken only by the rustle of wind in the treetops and the murmur of a nearby stream. The container was set up facing the forest. Andrei Nikolaevich gave the command to open it. Semyonik slowly pulled the lever, and the heavy door creaked open. Umka was the first to come out. She paused briefly on the threshold, sniffing the unfamiliar forest scents, then confidently stepped out into freedom. She took a few steps, looked around, and let out a soft questioning purr, as if calling Potap to follow. Potap appeared next. He was, as always, calm and composed. He stepped out of the container, stood next to Umka, and together they looked at the people standing just a few steps away. There was no fear or aggression in their eyes, rather, a silent gratitude and farewell. Then, they turned at the same time and slowly walked side by side toward the forest. Their powerful figures dissolved into the deepening twilight, leaving behind only a gentle rustle in the grass and clearly visible tracks on the damp earth. People stood silently, watching them go. Their hearts were filled with both joy and a touch of sadness. Joy, because these amazing creatures had regained their freedom and returned home. Sadness, because this was a farewell. Sokolov felt a lump rise in his throat. He remembered that terrible day at Black Creek, Potap's rage, Umka's despair, their incredible devotion to one another. This story would forever remain in his memory. Well, that's it, Andrei Nikolaevich said quietly, breaking the silence. Now they are home. Let's hope everything will be all right for them. He approached Sokolov and shook his hand. Thank you, Viktor, for everything. If it weren't for you, this story might never have happened. Sokolov only nodded in response, unable to find the words. He knew he would never forget these two bears who had taught him something truly important, something that couldn't be put into words but would forever remain in his heart. A few months passed. Summer had returned, painting the taiga in lush green hues. Life in the reserve and forest patrol resumed its usual course. Viktor Sokolov continued to patrol his sector, fighting poachers and forest fires, helping lost mushroom pickers and tourists. But often, when alone with nature, he would remember Umka and Potap, wondering how their lives had turned out in the wild. Sometimes, during aerial patrols by helicopter or while reviewing footage from camera traps set in remote corners of the taiga, reserve staff would try to find signs of their former wards, but without success. The taiga knows how to keep its secrets. However, one day in late August, a group of biologists conducting field research in the area where the bears had been released stumbled upon something amazing. On the bank of a small forest river, they discovered fresh tracks of two large bears walking side by side. A bit further off, on soft clay soil, were the clear prints of small bear cub paws, 2 pairs of tiny tracks. The biologists couldn't believe their eyes. They thoroughly examined the area and soon found more evidence to support their hunch. Flattened grass in a hidden spot where the bear family had likely rested, remains of partially eaten fish, and distinctive scratch marks on tree trunks. There was no doubt it was Umka, Potap, and their 2 cubs. The news quickly reached the reserve and Sokolov. He immediately set out to the site, along with Andrei Nikolaevich and Irina Volskaya. Seeing the tracks with his own eyes, he felt an incredible joy and relief. Their story had received the happiest continuation one could imagine. They hadn't just survived and adapted to life in the wild, they had started a family. Andrei Nikolaevich, looking at the cubs' tracks, smiled. Here it is, the best proof that we did everything right. Nature has put everything in its place. Their love and devotion had proven stronger than all trials. Irina Volskaya quietly wiped away a tear. She remembered all too well the condition Umka had been in when she was first brought to the clinic, and how fiercely Potap had fought for her life, then waited patiently for her recovery. Now that devotion had borne fruit. Sokolov stood by the riverbank for a long time, looking at the tracks leading into the depths of the forest. He imagined Umka leading her little ones, Potap walking beside them, still vigilantly guarding his family. He felt pride for these animals, and for the people who had helped them survive and find happiness. This story had become more than just another case in his forest patrol career, it became a symbol of how even in the wildest, harshest world, there is room for love, loyalty, and sacrifice. And that sometimes, the strongest bonds are not just between people, but also with those who share this planet with us. Our silent neighbors, whose lives are full of dramas, tragedies, and astonishing stories of devotion. He knew he would return to that clearing at Black Creek again and again in his thoughts, to Potap's furious roar and that incredible feeling he had experienced witnessing a miracle. Several more years passed after the bear family's tracks were discovered. Umka and Potap, as well as their now-grown cubs, were occasionally caught on camera traps in their habitat. Reserve staff and Viktor Sokolov followed their lives with bated breath, rejoicing at each new photo, every sign of their well-being. The cubs had grown up, become independent, and left their parents to start their own lives in the vast taiga. But Umka and Potap were still together. They were seen in berry meadows, by the river during the salmon run, or simply resting in the shade of cedars. They had become a true legend of the region, a symbol of unbreakable devotion and strength of spirit. Viktor Sokolov often told this story to his younger colleagues, using it as an example of how wondrous and complex the world of wild nature is, and how important it is to treat it with respect and understanding. He would say that the job of forest police is not only about fighting violators but also about protecting those who cannot defend themselves, those whose lives depend on our compassion and responsibility. One day, already holding the rank of major and head of the district forest police, Viktor Andreevich found himself again at that very place by Black Creek. He came not on duty, but simply following the call of his heart. The clearing where that terrible drama once unfolded had barely changed, the same thick grass, the same willow bushes by the water, the same ancient trees all around. Sokolov stood there for a while, listening to the silence of the taiga, the rustle of leaves and birdsong. He remembered everything down to the smallest detail, the desperation in Umka's eyes, Potap's rage, the gleaming coils of the python, his own helplessness, and the sudden spark of hope. He closed his eyes, and once again the scene of that unbelievable battle came to life before him, that shocking display of a bear's loyalty. And once again he felt that same awe and respect for these mighty, noble animals. He didn't know whether Umka and Potap were still alive. The lifespan of a bear isn't very long. But he believed their story, their love and loyalty lived on, in their descendants, in the whispers of the taiga, in the hearts of those who knew them and those who had only heard of them. And that belief warmed his soul. He opened his eyes and smiled. The taiga around him carried on its usual, measured life, and somewhere out there, in its boundless expanse, the eternal story of struggle and survival, love and loyalty, continued, a story he was lucky to be a part of. And that, perhaps, was the most precious memory of his long and difficult service in defense of Siberia's nature. Because sometimes, the most incredible and shocking acts are not committed by people, but by those we tend to think of as just wild animals, creatures supposedly incapable of deep emotion. The story of Umka and Potap was a shining example of that.